Welcome to the Olive Grove podcast. This is the deep dive.
The show where we take your sources, your research, your notes.
And we really jump in head first, trying to pull out the core insights. Today, we're diving into something really thought-provoking.
Yes, we're looking at excerpts from a study focusing on Ecclesiastes chapter 10.
And specifically, we're kind of zeroing in on this theme that, well, it feels ancient, but honestly, it hits surprisingly close to home. Fools in high places.
Right. Our source material for this whole exploration is a study. It's titled MCS Ecclesiastes 10.
Okay.
And it gives us an interpretation, a commentary, on this really powerful biblical text.
So our mission today really is to unpack what this study is telling us. What is the source saying about the basic nature of foolishness versus wisdom, especially when you see those traits showing up in positions of authority,
Yes.
leadership.
Exactly. And why these observations, which are literally thousands of years old, why do they still resonate? Why aren't they just historical footnotes?
Why do they feel maybe even urgent for understanding our world right now?
Yeah. And the text, as the source presents it, it gets straight to a really core, vivid image right away.
Okay.
It highlights this idea that just a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. The analogy uses think about dead flies. A tiny handful falling into expensive, fragrant, perfumed oil.
Ah, yeah.
Just that small bit of decay, it ruins the entire precious batch, makes it stink.
Such a powerful image and kind of visceral. It suggests foolishness isn't just like a minor character flaw. Even a little bit can be completely destructive.
Precisely. And that's really the foundational idea we're going to explore, how that seemingly small amount of folly can have these huge, disproportionately negative consequences, especially when people who lack that essential sense, that wisdom, well, when they end up in charge.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with that fundamental comparison the source draws right from the beginning of chapter 10. What does it tell us about wisdom and folly?
Well, like we said, the source points straight to Ecclesiastes 10.1 in that striking analogy.
Yeah.
Dead flies in the perfumed oil. You've got wisdom and honor depicted as something valuable, beautiful, like that expensive perfume. And then just a little foolishness, the dead flies, ruins it completely, makes it decay, makes it stink.
So at their root, how does the source define these two opposing forces, wisdom and folly?
So based on this study's interpretation, wisdom isn't just about being smart in a worldly way, knowledgeable. It's fundamentally about listening to God's plan and actually following it.
Okay.
And folly or foolishness is the direct opposite. It's ignoring God's plan or even actively denying it, denying his direction for life.
And according to the source's take on verses 2 and 3, how does this basic difference actually show up in a person, in their nature?
It manifests pretty deeply. A wise person's heart, and that means, their inner self, their core desires, their direction leads them rightly towards that divine plan. But a fool's heart, it leads them astray. The source connects this back to the idea that humans were formed in God's image, which gives everyone this inherent sort of pull, a desire to know him. The fool is someone who actively ignores that calling.
And it's not just internal, right? It becomes visible.
Oh, absolutely. The study notes that the fool lacks sense, even in really simple things, just traveling from one place to another. Their foolishness isn't hidden. It becomes obvious to everyone around them just by how they live, the choices they make, how they navigate the world. Because they've rejected that core calling, you see. They're following their own flawed ways, and it becomes clear.
That's a powerful insight. Rejecting a fundamental truth makes even basic actions reveal a lack of sense. Okay, so the text shifts a bit here. It gives advice for dealing with authority, specifically an angry ruler. What does the source highlight from Ecclesiastes 10.4?
The advice is stay at your post, because calmness soothes great offenses.
Okay, but the source's interpretation is key here. It's not just saying, give in and become a yes man, is it?
No, absolutely not. The source is really careful to clarify this. It interprets this verse not as some kind of if you can't fight him, join him strategy.
Right.
But more as a recognition that if you're walking in wisdom, meaning if you're genuinely following the Lord, you're inherently going to face opposition, sometimes even persecution, from worldly power structures that aren't aligned with that wisdom.
Okay.
Jesus actually warned his followers about exactly this. The fool, on the other hand, they don't really experience this kind of conflict because they just sort of go with the flow. They follow worldly trends or blindly obey men. They don't challenge the underlying foolishness that might provoke an angry ruler who represents that folly in high places.
Okay, so the insight is that opposition can sometimes be a sign that you're actually standing on solid, wise ground. Staying calm at your post is about maintaining your integrity, your position rooted in wisdom, even when you're under pressure from foolish authority.
Precisely.
And this brings us right to the central evil under the sun that the source observes in verses 5 through 7.
Yes. This is where we land squarely on the problem of fools in high places. The study highlights a key mistake mentioned out in the text. Rulers making the error of elevating fools, putting them in prominent positions.
While the others.
While those described as rich, and the source interprets this not as financially wealthy, but as those who possess the valuable things of God in their hearts and minds, they're left in humble places, unimportant places.
And the imagery used here is incredibly stark, isn't it?
It really is. It paints a picture you can just visualize. Servants, representing those who lack true wisdom or spiritual richness, riding on horses, elevated, in positions of prominence.
Well, the princes.
Meanwhile, the princes interpreted by the source as those genuinely serving the Lord. They're walking on foot, like slaves, in positions of lowliness or subservience.
Wow. And the source connects this ancient observation to things we might see even today.
Yeah, it makes the point that you often see ministries or maybe individuals who are truly committed to following God's word, trying to manifest his wisdom. They're often not living the high life in terms of worldly status or wealth. It mirrors that ancient observation. Those with genuine spiritual richness or wisdom often occupy less prominent positions in the world's eyes compared to those who might be operating out of folly but have somehow managed to gain worldly elevation.
So the insight is that worldly promotion often doesn't really line up with true wisdom or spiritual value?
That seems to be the observation, yes.
Okay, given that, what are the actual consequences when these fools are in power? The source uses a whole series of vivid analogies from everyday work risks in verses 8 through 11.
Right. It illustrates the inherent dangers. If you dig a pit, you might fall into it yourself. Simple cause and effect.
Yeah.
If you try to break through a wall, you risk getting bitten by a snake hidden there. Quarrying stones, you can get hurt. Chopping wood puts you in danger. These are just realities of physical work.
And the source uses these seemingly simple physical risks to illustrate a bigger, maybe more profound danger.
Exactly. The study interprets these work dangers as analogies for the risks involved when people rely on flawed or foolish approaches to solve life's big problems, particularly when they believe that worldly systems like politics hold all the answers.
Especially
with foolish people in charge. The insight is that folly in leadership creates these systemic dangers that are almost as inevitable and certainly as harmful as falling into a pit you dug yourself.
Like that blunt hatchet analogy in verse 10.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. If your tool, your hatchet, your approach, your wisdom is dull, you have to put in way more effort, right?
Yeah.
And you're less effective.
Right.
The expert's skill, their sharpness or wisdom, it's an advantage because it makes the work more efficient and, crucially, less dangerous. Trying to hack through something with a dull blade is just hard work, and you're way more likely to hurt yourself.
So the insight is that wisdom isn't just about efficiency, it's a form of protection.
Protection against the inherent dangers of trying to build or change things in the world, yes.
And what about the snake charmer analogy? Skill is useless if the snake bites first.
Yeah, that adds another layer. It implies that just having potential skill or knowledge, well, it isn't enough. If the danger the snake strikes before you can effectively apply that skill, charm it,
then it's too late.
Then your expertise was useless. So the insight here, building on the previous one, is that folly doesn't just make work harder. It can make efforts entirely futile. It leaves you vulnerable to sudden destructive consequences because you just couldn't apply the necessary wisdom in time.
This leads us pretty seamlessly into the characteristics of a fool's speech and its damaging impact, which is covered in verses 12 through 15.
Yeah, it's a really stark contrast. The words of the wise, they bring favor, they build things up. But the lips of a fool, the source notes, they essentially swallow up the fool. Their own words become their undoing. What a fool starts saying might seem, merely foolish at first, maybe nonsensical, maybe just misguided. But according to this study, it predictably devolves. It spirals down into wicked madness.
And the source even uses a historical figure as a pretty striking illustration of this progression.
It does, yeah. It points to Adolf Hitler as an example. The study notes how his early rhetoric might have seemed foolish, maybe like a child's ravings to some people initially.
Right.
But it clearly progressed into wicked madness. A state so divorced from sense that eventually he refused counsel from literally anyone. The insight there is that folly in speech isn't static. It has this dangerous trajectory towards greater harm and irrationality.
And the fool seems unable to stop talking, but says nothing of substance.
Exactly. They talk excessively, but the text, as interpreted by the source, highlights their fundamental lack of understanding. They don't know the future. They can't even articulate what will happen after they're gone. It shows this profound lack of perspective or foresight. Their constant efforts are often self-defeating. They just wear themselves out. And the blunt phrase used is they don't even know the way to town.
That's a powerful image.
Isn't it? It suggests a fundamental lack of basic common sense or direction, even in the absolute simplest matters.
It paints this picture of someone just utterly lost, exhausting themselves through their own lack of sense, despite this torrent of words coming out.
Precisely. Their internal folly, which is evident in their actions and their words, it just leads to this state of being directionless and completely ineffective.
Okay, we're going to take just a moment here. All this discussion about wisdom and folly and navigating a really challenging world, it definitely highlights the importance of having solid ground beneath your feet.
It really does. And actually, we wanted to share about something that has been a source of just incredible examples of navigating the world from a foundation of faith and wisdom. It's a book called Misfits for Jesus, True Accounts of People Experiencing Jesus.
You can find it on Amazon, and it shares true stories, real-life accounts of God's miraculous workings through Enduring Freedom Ministries, EFM.
Yeah, these aren't just made-up tales. They're real accounts that show how God works through the ministry, bringing hope and transformation in really tangible ways. EFM is dedicated to sharing the good news, but also practical support, really embodying that kind of wisdom in action.
And speaking of practical support and demonstrating God's heart, Enduring Freedom Ministries is actually working right now to establish a food pantry in Jerusalem, Israel.
Yeah, a really vital initiative.
Absolutely, to serve those in need in that really significant city. So if you feel led, if you want to support this work and help bring essential resources to the community there, we'd really encourage you to consider donating to EFM. You can find information on how to do that through their website.
It's definitely a powerful way to live out some of the principles of care and wisdom we've been discussing, supporting a very tangible effort to bless others.
Okay, back to the text. We see a really stark contrast presented in verses 16 and 17. It's about the state of a land, a nation, under different kinds of rulers.
Yes, there's a strong warning. Woe to you, land, when your king is a child and your leaders start their parties in the morning.
Parties in the morning.
Yeah, the source interprets that as leaders prioritizing their own pleasure, their own desires, indulging themselves instead of actually tending to the nation's needs.
And the blessed alternative, what does that look like?
Happy are you, land, when your king is well born and your princes eat at the proper time in order to stay strong, not to get drunk.
Okay.
This describes godly, wise rulers. They're concerned with the well-being of the people. Eating at the proper time to stay strong implies making sensible choices for the benefit of effectiveness and service, not just sheer indulgence.
Right. So the insight is pretty clear. The character and the priorities of leaders directly impact the health, the happiness of the society they govern.
Absolutely.
And there's another powerful analogy here, isn't there, about a house falling into disrepair.
Yes. Ecclesiastes 10.18 gives us this image. When the owner is lazy, the roof sags. When hands are idle, the house leaks.
Simple truth.
It's a simple, universal truth applied to leadership. Lazy leaders, negligent leaders, self-serving leaders. They lead to the disrepair and decay of the nation they're supposed to be caring for. Just like an uncared-for house simply falls apart. The insight is that folly in leadership leads, almost inevitably, to decline and suffering for the people.
And the source explicitly connects this ancient observation to, contemporary situations.
It does. It makes the point that we see this playing out in many countries today. You have leaders living these luxurious lives, maybe figuratively having their parties in the morning,
right,
while their country is plagued by poverty and neglect. It precisely mirrors that ancient observation of national disrepair resulting from leadership idleness and self-indulgence.
So the text then touches on a key motivation for this self-serving behavior, which seems to be greed in verse 19.
Right. Parties are made for having a good time, wine adds cheer to life, and money has an answer for everything. The source highlights this as the worldview of these self-serving rulers, these fools in high places.
Money answers everything.
They see money and personal pleasure as the ultimate solutions, the highest priorities. It fundamentally replaces faith and reliance on God with, faith in wealth and indulgence.
Okay, finally, the last verse in this chapter, verse 20, it offers a rather pragmatic warning. maybe cautionary.
Yeah, it says, don't insult the king, not even in your thoughts, and don't insult the wealthy, not even in your bedroom. For a bird in the air might carry the news, a creature with wings might repeat what you said.
And the source notes that this ancient warning is perhaps even more relevant today, maybe even a bit unsettling in our modern world.
Oh, absolutely. The study points out that with today's technology, widespread surveillance, digital footprints, these interconnected networks, governments, and powerful entities have unprecedented access to information about individuals.
Yeah, scary thought sometimes.
They know far more about our private thoughts and communications than was ever conceivable back in ancient times. So that warning about private words getting out feels incredibly potent. Maybe, yeah, a little unnerving given the capabilities of modern tech.
So the insight there isn't necessarily endorsing surveillance.
No, not at all. But it's a sober recognition from both the text and the source that powerful people often have ears everywhere, and our modern world has just amplified that reality exponentially.
So, okay, pulling all this together then, what's the overall message the source wants us to take from this chapter, especially thinking about that final warning?
Well, the study concludes this section by emphasizing a kind of dual perspective. On one hand, we're cautioned to respect positions of authority. That's a principle embedded right there in the text. But alongside that, and maybe even more importantly, we have to hold on to the overarching truth. God remains ultimately in control.
No.
And that perspective is vital, especially when we observe the kinds of situations described, when fools are in the high places. The insight is that while we navigate the realities of human authority, with all its flaws, our ultimate trust and our understanding of who's really in control must rest with the divine.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive into the MCS study of Ecclesiastes chapter 10 really gives us a powerful ancient lens to view these enduring human patterns.
It really does. It lays bare the corrosive nature of folly, doesn't it? Not just as some personal failing, but as a genuinely destructive force, especially when it gets power, when it's amplified in leadership positions.
Yeah.
We see the inevitable dangers it poses to individuals and, on a larger scale, to whole societies.
And through the source's interpretation, the chapter just constantly contrasts that destructive folly with life-giving wisdom. The wisdom of aligning with God's plan versus the folly of ignoring it. And it shows how this fundamental choice just manifests with profound consequences, both in individual lives and in the collective state of a nation.
Yeah, ultimately, while acknowledging the very real problems, the frustrations of foolish leadership and societal decay that the text describes, the study brings us back to that essential perspective. Despite the chaos, despite the dangers, despite the apparent triumph of folly in high places, God remains sovereign. God remains in control.
That provides a crucial anchor point.
It really does.
So, considering these incredibly timeless descriptions of foolishness and its consequences, and that ultimate perspective on control presented in this study, what does this ancient text, seen through the lens of this commentary, suggest about the kind of deep fundamental wisdom that's truly needed? Not just to lead effectively, maybe, but simply to navigate and live well in the complex world we all find ourselves in today.
There's definitely a lot to think about.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. You can find more deep dives just like this one by subscribing to the Olive Grove podcast over on YouTube.